Stay silent. The words didn't sound like a request, or even fear. They sounded like a rule written in blood. King Lucian Raventhrn had stepped across the threshold of his own palace, expecting torchlight. Ceremony, the familiar weight of loyalty. But he was met by darkness, and the sudden grip of a trembling human hand sealing his mouth. The maid dragged him backward into a narrow linen closet, the scent of soap and old stone pressing in around them. And for one stunned second, Lucien almost reacted on instinct. He was an immortal sovereign, feared for centuries, crowned by power that made entire courts bow without being asked, yet something in her eyes stopped him. They weren't just frightened. They were certain. The kind of certainty that meant someone had already decided how tonight would end. Through the slatted door, footsteps moved closer in a measured rhythm. Not the lazy patrol of guards, but the clean coordination of hunters. The maid's heartbeat thundered so loudly Lucien could feel it through the air. But her grip didn't loosen, and when he tried to turn his head, she pressed her mouth to his ear and breathed, "If you speak, you die." Lucien's pride flared at the sentence, but his body answered with a wave of weakness that had been haunting him for weeks, an ugly dizziness that made the marble beneath his boots feel unstable. He swallowed it down and stayed still, because a king could not afford to misread danger, and tonight the danger was wearing his home like a mask. Voices floated into the corridor, soft at first, then clear enough to cut. One voice was unmistakable Queen Seraphine, his consort, whose smile in public was legendary, and whose warmth in private had become rare as mercy. The other belonged to Lord Alaric, Lucien's younger brother, always charming, always hungry, always standing just close enough to the throne to make the court wonder if the crown might someday choose him instead. "He's still standing," Alaric muttered, frustration sharpening his tone, as if Lucien were a stubborn problem rather than a sovereign. Seraphine laughed quietly, a sound like poured wine. "I told you the poison works slowly," she said, calm and intimate, as if they were discussing a garden, not a murder. "I already doubled the dose in the ritual chalice. By the new moon, he won't have the strength to question anything." Lucien's immortal blood went cold. In one instant, every dizzy spell, every sudden tremor in his hand during council, every moment he had felt his power dim at the edges snapped into brutal focus. It wasn't age. It wasn't a curse from an enemy kingdom. It was poison served with devotion, poured by a queen's hand during sacred rites meant to honor the Raventhrn bloodline. Alaric's voice returned, eager now. "And the documents?" he asked. "The re-swearing ceremony, will the Night Guard accept it?" Seraphine's reply was silk over steel. They already did. He wasn't present to bind it with his blood authority. The guard captain answers to you now, not him. The moment he weakens enough, we announce his illness. We guide him to sign, and if he refuses... She paused, and Lucien could almost hear the curve of her smile. "We call it madness. The court loves a tragedy." The maid's fingers tightened around Lucien's wrist as the voices drifted away down the hall, their laughter fading like the last warm breath before winter. Lucien stood frozen, not because he lacked strength, but because betrayal landed heavier than any blade. The palace he had built on oaths and order had been quietly rearranged behind his back. His wife, his brother, two people seated closest to his power, had turned his trust into a weapon and his crown into a coffin. The maid waited until the corridor fell silent again, then opened the closet door a crack, listening like a creature trained by danger. She moved with the skill of someone who survived by being underestimated. Lucien finally pulled in a slow breath and whispered, "Who are you?" The maid's eyes flicked to his face, as if she couldn't afford softness. "Myra," she said. No dramatic bow, no flattery, only a name and the trembling truth behind it. "I clean the eastern wing. I carry linens. I pour wine when they command me." She swallowed, and Lucien noticed bruising at her wrist faint, half healed like someone had gripped her too hard and too often. "I was there," she added quietly, "when they changed the oaths." Lucien's hand moved instinctively toward the signet ring that should have summoned the night guard with one command. And Myra snapped forward and caught his wrist again, stronger than her small frame suggested. "Don't," she hissed. "Your captain answers to Alaric now. Calling him is signing your own execution order." The words hit Lucien harder than any insult. For centuries, the ring had opened every door, commanded every oath, ended every argument. Now it was a beacon for his hunters. Lucien's jaw clenched, and a surge of hunger rose sharp and wrong inside him, not the controlled hunger of a predator who knew his limits, but a jagged need, like the poison was severing the steady bond between his body and the blood that sustained him. His vision narrowed. His fangs ached. He hated that Myra saw it, and he hated more that she didn't flinch. "I know what you're feeling," she whispered quickly, eyes bright with fear, but not fear of him, fear for him. "That's why they did it. If you lose control, if you're seen feeding like a beast, they'll paint you as a monster. They'll turn the people against you and pretend they're saving the kingdom." Lucien forced himself to breathe through the hunger, through the rage, through the humiliation of needing a human girl's guidance to survive his own palace. "Why are you helping me?" he rasped. "Why risk your life for a king who barely knew your name?" Myra's mouth tightened, and for a second, Lucien saw the weight of years in her expression, years of being stepped over, spoken over, treated as less than human. "Because I saw the truth," she said, voice low but unbreakable. "And because no one deserves to die in their own home, while traitors call it loyalty." She moved with urgency, stripping him of everything traceable, like she was peeling him out of the story they'd written for his death. The signet ring came off and vanished into her pocket. His ceremonial cloak, embroidered with the Raventhorn crest, was shoved behind a beam as if it were common cloth. His jeweled clasp, his marked rings, symbols of centuries, were wrapped in kitchen rags like ordinary cutlery. Each item removed felt like a layer of identity ripped away, leaving only flesh and fear. "If they see the crown, they don't see you?" Mira whispered. "They see what they can take." Then she led him into hidden servant tunnels he had never known existed, narrow passages behind panels, stairways that smelled of dust and old secrets. A second skeleton of the palace built for invisible people. Alarm bells began to toll above them, too perfectly timed to be real, and Lucien understood with sick certainty. They were already rewriting his absence into a narrative of madness or abandonment. By the time they slipped beyond the palace walls, Lucien was no longer the untouchable king returning home early. He was prey, and the only shield between him and the grave was a poor maid the palace had taught everyone to ignore. That night, Lucien learned power could be poisoned, but kindness could still pull him back from the grave. Asterisk. By the time dawn crept into the servant quarter like a cautious witness, Lucien Raventhorn understood that surviving the night had not saved him. It had only stripped him bare enough to see the truth. Fever still burned under his skin, rising and falling in cruel waves that left his limbs heavy and his thoughts sharp with regret. And he lay on the narrow cot in Myra's small room, listening to the ordinary sounds of life beyond thin walls, vendors calling, footsteps passing, a child laughing somewhere far away, while his own kingdom quietly rearranged itself without him. Each breath felt like a negotiation with the poison that Seraphim had poured into him with a lover's smile. And with every shallow sleep, his mind replayed the past weeks like a confession. He could no longer escape. The dizziness he had dismissed as exhaustion, the tremor in his hand while signing decrees, the way his brother's advice had suddenly carried more weight than his own instincts. He had told himself that trust was strength, that a king who ruled by fear alone would rot from the inside. Yet here he was, hunted by the very people he had elevated, protected only by a human maid who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Mira moved quietly through the room, replacing the cool cloth on his forehead, checking the door, listening to the corridor the way prey listens for predators. And Lucien hated the shame curling in his chest when he realized she was calmer than he was. "They'll be searching everywhere," he murmured, voice rough. "They'll tell the court I'm ill or unstable." Mira nodded once, practical and unsentimental. "They already are," she said. "I heard guards talking before I brought you here. A false alarm in the West Wing. Orders to look for signs of madness. They're shaping the story before anyone asks questions." Lucien swallowed hard, the truth cutting deeper than the poison dot asterisk. For centuries, he had believed stories belonged to kings, that proclamations and decrees defined reality, but he was learning too late that stories were sharper when told by those who controlled fear. Hunger surged again, sudden and vicious, twisting his gut and dragging his fangs down with a pressure that made his vision blur. And he turned his face away in disgust, clenching his fists until the urge passed. Myra noticed anyway. She always did. She reached into a small pouch and produced a dark vial, uncorking it with steady hands. "It won't cure you," she said before he could ask. "It only slows the poison and keeps the hunger from tearing you apart. An apothecary in the lower district gave it to me." Lucien frowned. "Why would he help you?" Myra's mouth curved into a sad, knowing smile. "Because he treats people who are ignored," she said. "Because he knows what it's like to be crushed by nobles who think power excuses everything." Lucien drank the bitter liquid and felt the edge of the hunger dull. And something in him shifted not relief, but a quiet, burning shame. He had allowed a system where kindness survived only in shadows, while cruelty wore silk and crowns. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, stripped of royal certainty. "What have they done to you?" Myra hesitated, then answered with a bluntness born of exhaustion rather than self-pity. "What they do to all of us," she said. "They remind us we're replaceable. Guards grab too hard. Nobles mock us because they're bored. If we speak, we're punished for disrespect. If we stay silent, they say we deserve it." She met his eyes, and Lucien flinched not from fear, but from recognition. "They hurt people because they can," she finished. The words lodged in his chest like a blade he had forged himself. Determination replaced despair as the morning wore on, and Lucien forced himself upright despite the weakness trembling through him. "Then we don't fight them with strength," he said slowly. "We fight them with truth." Myra studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that," she replied, and guided him through the servant tunnels once more, not to flee, but to gather proof. They moved through forgotten corridors into a storage chamber buried beneath rotting tapestries, where Myra knelt and slid aside a loose stone to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside lay folded letters, sealed notes, and a cracked leather ledger. Lucien's breath caught as he opened it and saw names, dates, coded references to ritual wine deliveries, dosage marks tied to the new moon, and the unmistakable seal of Seraphine's steward. Proof ugly, undeniable, and collected by a woman the court would never listen to. "I wasn't trying to be brave," Myra said quietly as he read. "I was trying to survive. But then I realized, if they can poison a king, no one is safe." Lucien closed the ledger with shaking hands, rage and resolve settling into something harder than fury. Footsteps echoed suddenly in the tunnel beyond, voices sharp with command, and Myra's head snapped up. "They're close," she whispered. "They're hunting now, not searching." Lucien rose, swaying but standing, and for the first time since the betrayal, he felt something other than weakness in his veins. Not power. Not yet, but purpose. He reached for his cloak out of instinct, and stopped himself as Mira tore it free from his shoulders without ceremony. "Every symbol makes you visible," she said. "Every mark of power makes you prey." The cloak fell to the stone like shed skin, and Lucien let it go. As they slipped deeper into the palace's hidden arteries, he understood the bitter truth at last. The crown had protected everyone around him, while leaving him exposed at the center. And only now, stripped of it, could he see clearly enough to become the king his people deserved, stripped of his crown and guided by a maid's courage. Lucien chose truth over pride, and began the long path back to justice. The city beyond the palace walls, woke slowly, unaware that its king was walking its narrow streets like a ghost, stripped of name and crown, guided only by a maid who knew how to survive where power could not. Lucien moved through the lower district with Mira close beside him, his senses dulled by poison but sharpened by humiliation. Every sound too loud, every smell too honest. Here there were no polished floors or velvet drapes, only cracked stone, smoke from cook fires, and people who worked until their hands shook because rest was a luxury they could not afford. For the first time in centuries, Lucien felt the weight of hunger not as a weapon, but as a weakness, and it terrified him how easily it could be used against him. Mira led him into the apothecary's shop, a narrow place hidden between a baker and a shuttered tailor, where dried herbs hung from the ceiling like quiet witnesses. The old apothecary took one look at Lucien's pallor and Mira's bruised wrists and closed the door without asking questions. "Poison bound to ritual wine," he said after examining Lucien, his voice low and careful. "Cleverly done. It weakens authority before it kills the body." He prepared a stronger binder, warning it would buy time, not victory. And Lucien paid with a ring he had once worn to council, a ring that meant nothing here, but could still feed a family for weeks. Outside, a commotion rippled through the street as armored guards passed, shouting orders about an unstable king and a false threat to public safety. Lucien watched the fear on the people's faces and felt a cold truth settle in his chest. His enemies were already using his name to justify cruelty. When a guard shoved a beggar aside for blocking the road, Myra flinched instinctively, then squared her shoulders and stepped forward. "Leave him," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the risk. The guard laughed at her, called her a servant who should remember her place, and raised his hand. Lucien moved before he could think, catching the wrist mitre with a strength that surprised them both. He released the guard just as quickly, knowing exposure would mean death, but the moment burned itself into his memory, not the power, but Myra's refusal to look away. Later, as they hid in an abandoned shrine, Lucien confronted the truth he had avoided. "I let this happen," he said, voice hollow. "I let them build a world where people like you had no protection." Mira met his gaze, eyes fierce and tired. "Then change it," she said simply. "Not with fear, with sight." They returned to the palace's edge through tunnels Mira knew by heart, slipping into a forgotten archive beneath the eastern wing. There, among dust and rot, they found records the court had buried, old complaints against guards, reports dismissed, names crossed out. Proof of a pattern, not an accident. As Lucien read, footsteps echoed again, closer than before, and his hunger surged violently, tearing at him until his fangs pressed painfully against his gums. Myra saw it and didn't step back. She took his shaking hands and grounded him with her voice, reminding him to breathe, reminding him he was more than what they had turned him into. In that closeness, something fragile and dangerous formed. Not desire, not yet, but trust. When guards burst into the outer corridor, Mira made a choice that could not be undone. She cut her paw with a small blade and pressed it to Lucien's mouth. "Just enough," she whispered. "Live, Lucien froze, every instinct screaming refusal, but her eyes held his without fear, only resolve. He took only what he needed, stopping himself with agony and gratitude tangled together, and when he pulled away, the hunger receded, leaving clarity in its wake. Voices shouted nearby. Mira smeared blood on a broken seal and triggered an alarm in another wing, drawing the hunt away from them. As they escaped once more into the palace's hidden veins, Lucien understood the twist fate had carved into his story. The maid he had never seen was not only his savior, she was the mirror showing him the ruler he had failed to be. In the darkness beneath his own palace, Lucien learned that true strength was restraint, and that the bravest heart in the kingdom beat in a maid's chest. Asterisk, by the time the palace bells rang for the midday council, Lucien Raventhern understood that the hunt for him had become theater. From the shadows of the servant passages, he listened as proclamations echoed through marble halls, carefully chosen words about concern, stability, and the king's temporary indisposition. Seraphine's voice carried authority without warmth, soothing and firm, while Alaric's presence filled the gaps with decisive urgency. They were not searching anymore. They were performing. Mera guided Lucien deeper into the palace's forgotten bones, past chambers sealed by time and fear, and he felt the sting of irony burn through him. The palace he had ruled was safest where he had never bothered to look. His hunger, held in check by the binder and Myra's resolve, simmered like a contained storm, and each step tested his restraint. "We can't run forever," Lucien whispered, leaning against cold stone as his strength wavered. "No," Myra agreed quietly. "We don't run. We show them." She led him into a disused gallery beneath the council wing, a place where old trial records were once kept before politics replaced justice. There, hidden behind cracked shelving, they uncovered sealed testimony statements from servants, guards, and minor nobles that described disappearances, coerced confessions, and quiet punishments that never reached daylight. Names repeated. Patterns emerged. Alaric's seal appeared too often to be coincidence. Seraphine's steward had signed orders that never should have existed. Lucien's chest tightened as he read, recognizing the architecture of cruelty he had allowed to grow in the absence of scrutiny. "They didn't just betray me," he said, voice low and steady. "They practiced on everyone else first." Myra nodded. "People like me were the rehearsal," she said. Footsteps approached again, heavy, disciplined, and Myra stilled, listening. She pressed her ear to the wall and exhaled. "Council is assembling," she whispered. "If we're going to end this, it has to be now." Lucien's instincts screamed caution, but another voice newer, quieter urged responsibility. He could no longer be the king who waited for permission from fear. They moved through a concealed stair and emerged behind the council dais, separated from the hall by a carved screen meant for observers who were never invited to speak. Through the lattice, Lucien saw the faces of his court, anxious nobles, guarded captains, advisers measuring their words. Seraphine stood radiant and composed, offering sympathy in measured tones. Alaric addressed the room with practiced concern, proposing temporary authority until the king could be helped. Myra's hand tightened on Lucien's sleeve as murmurs swelled. Lucien felt the poison stir, his hunger flaring at the injustice of it all, and he closed his eyes for a heartbeat, grounding himself in Myra's presence, in the steady courage that had carried him this far. When he opened them, his resolve had hardened. He stepped forward, pushing the screen aside. Gasps rippled through the hall. "You speak of helping me," Lucien said, his voice carrying despite the weakness beneath it, "while you poison me in my own rights." Silence crashed down like a dropped blade. Seraphine's composure flickered for the first time, a hairline crack at the corner of her smile. Alaric recovered quickly, feigning shock. "Brother, you're unwell." "Enough," Lucien cut in. lifting the ledger Mira had protected with her life. He spoke plainly, without flourish, naming dates, doses, oaths changed without blood authority, guards resworn under false pretenses. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He let truth do what fear never could. The court shifted, whispers sharpening into suspicion. Captain Viron's jaw tightened as Lucien described the altered ceremony. Confusion crossed his face, then anger. Mira stepped forward before anyone could stop her, her voice steady and clear, as she testified to what she had seen, what she had carried, and what had been buried because she was only a maid. For a breathless moment, the balance wavered. Seraphine moved then, elegant and dangerous, accusing Lucien of madness, pointing to his pallor, his hunger, the impropriety of a servant speaking against royalty. Alaric echoed her, calling for restraint, for the king to be escorted for his own good. Guards hesitated. Lucien felt the pull of hunger surge as fear spiked in the room, and he mastered it. "Look at me," he said to the guards, meeting their eyes one by one. "I will submit to examination. I will drink nothing offered by my queen. And if I am lying, I will abdicate." The room froze. Seraphine's mask slipped. Alaric's certainty faltered. The apothecary from the lower district stepped forward summoned by Mira earlier, risking everything holding proof of the poison's composition and its source. The evidence stacked, undeniable. Captain Veron dropped to one knee, shame and fury warring on his face. Orders changed hands. Seraphine was detained, her protests cutting and cold. Alaric was seized as well, his charm dissolving into desperation. The council breathed again, not because justice was complete, but because it had begun. Lucien swayed, the cost of restraint finally demanding its due, and Myra caught him without hesitation, her arm firm around his waist. He looked at her then, not as a savior in secret, but as a partner in daylight, and the court saw it. Not romance, not yet, but respect earned in blood and courage got in the council's full light. Lucien chose truth over vengeance, and the kingdom watched a new kind of power take root. Asterisk, the days after the council felt heavier than the night of betrayal. Because justice did not arrive with applause, it arrived with consequences. The palace moved like a wounded animal, alert and uncertain, as arrests were finalized, oaths restored, and whispers replaced proclamations. Lucien Raventhorn remained under careful watch by his own order, submitting to examinations, refusing ritual wine, and allowing the apothecary's binders to do their slow, imperfect work. He would not rule from a throne until the truth had settled into every corner it had been denied. That choice cost him comfort and speed, but it bought something rarer: belief. Mira stayed close, not as a servant pulled into favor, but as a witness whose courage had already altered the story. Guards who once mocked her now lowered their eyes. Nobles who had never learned her name learned it quickly. The shift was uncomfortable and necessary, and Lucien watched it with a king's patience and a man's remorse. Recovery was not clean. Hunger still surged at the wrong moments, and weakness returned without warning, forcing Lucien to rest when his instincts demanded action. Each setback tempted him toward anger, toward the old certainty that fear could force order, but Mayra anchored him to restraint. She spoke plainly when he faltered, reminding him that power regained too quickly could rot again. "They're watching how you heal," she said one night as he struggled to steady his breath. "If you heal with cruelty, they'll learn nothing. If you heal with care, they'll learn courage." Lucien listened, because she had earned that right in darkness and daylight alike. The court convened again, not for ceremony, but for repair. Lucien ordered a public review of guard conduct and servant protections, opening channels that had never existed. Complaints once buried were heard aloud. Names were cleared. Others were stripped of authority. The process angered many who had grown fat on silence, and backlash followed swiftly. Anonymous letters warned Lucien that mercy was weakness. Rumors spread that the king had been softened by a human girl. Mira bore the brunt of it, enduring sharp glances and sharper words from those who resented her visibility. When a noble spat that she was manipulating the throne, Lucien answered without raising his voice. "If truth threatens you," he said, "the problem is not the truth." The room went quiet, and Myra felt something loosen in her chest, fear giving way to dignity. One evening, a frightened guard brought news that chilled the palace. In a sealed wing once overseen by Seraphine's steward, a child had been found hidden, ill, and guarded by orders that bore the queen's mark. Lucien's blood ran cold. The boy was young, vampiric, and weakened by neglect, his bond to the blood disrupted by controlled deprivation. The implications struck like a bell. Leverage, insurance, proof that Seraphine had planned for every outcome. Lucien knelt beside the bed, rage shaking his hands, and felt the hunger claw at him in response to injustice. Mira was there, steady as ever, guiding his breath, helping him hold the line. "He needs care, not fear," she whispered. "Let me help." Lucien hesitated only a moment before nodding. Mira worked through the night, cleaning wounds, preparing broths, and speaking softly in a rhythm that calmed the boy's shaking. When his breathing eased, she murmured words in an old cadence, gentle, precise and ancient tongue Lucien recognized dimly from forgotten texts, used long ago to soothe fledgling vampires whose bonds had been damaged. He stared, stunned. "How do you know that language?" he asked quietly. Myra flushed, embarrassed. "My mother taught me," she said. "She said it was for comfort, not power. I didn't know it mattered." It mattered. The boy's fever broke by dawn. Lucien felt something crack and reforge inside him, not only relief, but awe. The twist of fate was unmistakable. The woman dismissed as small-held knowledge the court had lost, knowledge that healed where authority could not. Asterisk news spread quickly, and with it came a reckoning. The court saw that salvation had arrived not with swords, but with care. Not with bloodshed, but with restraint and memory. Lucien made his decision public. Mira would be appointed as a crown witness and keeper of the servant archives, tasked with preserving truths that power preferred to forget. She accepted with humility, insisting on protections for others before privileges for herself. Lucien honored that insistence. The kingdom shifted again, this time toward balance. In private moments, silence grew comfortable between them. There were no rushed confessions, no promises carved too early. Their bond lived in actions, Lucien's hand steadying when hunger surged, Myra's voice guiding him back. Shared work that mattered. When he thanked her, she corrected him gently. "Change it," she said. "That will be thanks enough." He smiled, not as a king performing gratitude, but as a man learning it. The poison continued to fade, and with it the last illusions Lucien had clung to. He stood before the throne at last, not to reclaim old habits, but to commit to a new rule, one that saw the unseen and guarded the vulnerable. Mira stood at the edge of the hall, unbowed, unhidden, and the kingdom watched a truth take root that no crown alone could command. As healing spread through the palace, Lucien understood that the future of his reign rested not on fear, but on the quiet courage of the woman who taught him how to see. The coronation bells rang at dusk, not to announce a new king, but to mark the return of a kingdom to itself. Lucien Raventhorn stood before the throne he had once believed defined him, the poison fully purged at last, his strength steady and earned rather than assumed. The court gathered in honest light, stripped of the old theater that had protected lies, and the air felt different, less perfumed, more real. Lucien did not sit immediately. He looked instead at the faces before him, guards who had resworn their oaths with clear words and open eyes, nobles who now understood that silence would no longer be rewarded, servants who stood a little taller because someone had finally listened. At the edge of the hall, Mira waited, hands folded, posture calm, neither hidden nor elevated beyond her choosing. Lucien began simply. He spoke of failure without excuses, of trust misplaced, of power that had blinded him to suffering. He named the changes that would outlive him: open records, protected witnesses, shared oversight, so that no future crown could rot in comfort while people paid the price. The court listened because they had seen what truth could do. When Lucien finally took the throne, it was not applause that followed, but something rarer. Acceptance. Justice continued its careful work. Seraphine and Alaric faced public trial, not vengeance. Evidence spoke. Testimony held. Sentences were delivered without spectacle, firm and final. The kingdom learned that cruelty would not be answered with cruelty, but with consequence. The boy hidden away recovered fully, placed under the care of healers who treated him as a person, not leverage, and when he smiled again, the palace felt lighter for it. Lucien visited him often, not as a symbol, but as a guardian, and each visit reinforced the lesson that leadership was a practice, not a posture. Miera's days filled with purpose. As keeper of the servant archives, she restored records thought lost, trained others to document without fear, and built quiet systems that protected the vulnerable long after the drama faded. She refused excess, redirected honors to those who had survived in silence, and when offered finery, chose tools instead. Lucien supported every decision without overshadowing her, learning when to step back as carefully as when to step forward. Their conversations grew easy, grounded in shared work and mutual respect. There were no grand declarations, no hurried vows. Love, when it approached, did so on steady feet. Challenges tested the new order quickly. A border dispute threatened escalation. Old allies questioned reforms that limited unchecked authority. Lucien met each pressure with transparency, inviting scrutiny rather than deflecting it. He consulted widely, listened deeply, and chose restraint where force would once have been praised. Each choice cost him something: speed, comfort, admiration from those who preferred old certainties, but it bought trust, and trust proved stronger than fear. When hunger stirred, as it sometimes did, Myra's presence steadied him, not because she owed him, but because they had chosen each other's humanity. One evening, as the palace settled into quiet, Lucien found Mira in the archive room, candlelight reflecting off restored ledgers. He thanked her again, and she smiled, patient with the repetition. "You changed," she said gently. "That's the work." He hesitated, then spoke the truth he had earned the right to say. "I see you," he said, "not as a symbol, not as a savior, as a woman whose courage changed me." Mira met his gaze, warmth and resolve intertwined. "Then keep seeing," she replied. The moment held soft, unforced, and something lasting took shape out in time. Lucien made a final declaration to the court and the city beyond. The crown would no longer be inherited without consent. The people would have a voice. The announcement shocked some, inspired many, and anchored the reforms beyond one lifetime. Lucien knew it might cost him legacy, as history preferred to tell it, but he also knew legacy measured in names was smaller than legacy measured in lives improved. Mira stood beside him as the decree was read, not above anyone, not below, exactly where she chose to be. When the bells rang again at dawn, they sounded different, not triumphant, not ominous, just clear. Lucien looked out over a kingdom learning to breathe without fear, and for the first time he felt worthy of the throne he occupied. Myra took his hand, not to steady him, but to walk with him. And the path ahead opened, not perfect, not easy, but honest. Ending line. in choosing humility over fear and kindness over power. The vampire king found his true crown, and the maid who whispered, "Stay silent," became the voice that saved a kingdom.